Okay, folks. So welcome to the PIER seminar. I'm Tom Kane. I'm faculty director of the Center for Education Policy Research. Before we get started, I wanted to make a quick announcement that that applications for the next cohort of PIER fellowships is open. And it's available on the CPR website. The Harvard doctoral students in the social sciences, currently in G1 or G2, are eligible. And if you actually, why don't I have a show of hands for the current or former PIER fellows in the room to raise their hands? Oh, all right. So good. So you'd be able to join this happy group of merry travelers. So if you have any questions about the program, please ask Ashley Dixon, who is in the back in the black dress. Okay, so please remember that this session is being recorded, so keep that in mind when you're asking your questions. If you decide to be snarky, it'll be preserved forever. Questions are typically asked what's called econ style, which means you should feel free to ask questions in the midst of the presentation. If it gets out of hand, I may intervene, but just to help and move forward. But actually, I've rarely had to do that, so I'm sure it'll be fine. So you should, if you have a question in the moment, don't hesitate to ask. Now, I just want to introduce our speaker today, Anna Markowitz. Anna is an associate professor in the Human Development and Psychology Division of the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. She is also co-director of two different state-level early childhood research partnerships with Louisiana and Virginia. And we were talking about just her current work trying to build a relationship with LAUSD that we might talk about afterwards. She uses quantitative methods to explore how features of early childhood education programs impact children's experiences and thereby exacerbate or ameliorate income-based disparities in children's development. So I know we have a number of PIER students that are interested in early childhood education. So looking forward to hearing from you, Anna. So thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here talking with you all this afternoon. Like Tom said, my name is Anna Markowitz. I'm at UCLA, and my talk is about supporting early education policy with descriptive data. And as excited as I was to plan for this talk, this was also a really weird time to be planning this talk. I was supposed to come up and talk to you about how exciting it is to use data to solve problems in education. So it felt sort of like I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this is a time where data is being talked about and sort of undermined in a way that it hasn't been, at least in my living memory. In the past month or so, nearly $900 million in research contracts have been canceled in the Federal Department of Education alone. Data sources have disappeared from federal websites, particularly those related to health. And NAEP testing for high schoolers was canceled. For those of you who are not familiar with NAEP, it's the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and it allows us to say year after year how our kiddos have been doing. This is all the stuff that happened before I sat down to write the talk. Things are changing on the daily, so I do apologize if any of this is out of date. And this doesn't speak to the potential for canceled services and sort of emerging information that suggests that programs for children and families and educational programs are disproportionately affected by cuts from DOGE. So it's a tough time to be up here like, woo! But I think it also is a good time for those of us who are users of data, creators of data, devotees of data perhaps, to be making the case for why we want to preserve these institutions. If we can't make the case for why they're important, then what are we doing? And so what I want to do in this talk is sort of walk through what it is that we can do with data and why it is important. And one reason I like talking about this with K-12 is because I do think it's a place where data and research have been tremendously helpful over the past 40 or 50 years. So, you know, the challenges that we had with COVID-19 notwithstanding, which are challenges we know about in part because of data, just throwing that out there, we have seen educational improvements since the 1970s. If we look across NAEP, we, for all of the challenges that folks have had with No Child Left Behind, it also changed the way that we thought about educational outcomes and educational equity. We now know more than ever kind of what's happening in our schools and classrooms in terms of outcomes. Classes that are graduating now are far more diverse than they were 20 years ago, both at the high school and the college level. We are training kids in multiple languages in a way that we weren't 20 years ago when we thought that wasn't great for literacy. And a lot of this is due to data. Information that we have gathered from the Common Core of data, the National Center for Education Statistics, school and staffing surveys, and others that have supported our decision-making in terms of how we think about teachers and teacher quality, recruitment and retention, information about curriculum. Here I'm thinking particularly about the science of reading, which has come out lately and been a real revolution. And so all of this has happened because of education research and education policy research. So that's great. And I would really like all of you in the room to go out there and make that case. But unfortunately, it's been a very different story in early childhood, where we have what is known as the early childhood data deficit. This term was coined by some colleagues at UC Berkeley. This data deficit has occurred for a couple of reasons. One reason is that historically, the work of early educators has not been considered skilled labor or, in fact, educational labor. I would argue that that's erroneous, but because we haven't sort of perceived it that way, we have not taken detailed information on it like we have in other places. And then sort of related to the first, the places where young children receive care and education are highly fragmented in the United States. What I mean is that unlike in K-12, where, bless you, 95% of kids or thereabouts are in public schools, young children are served sometimes in family childcare homes, sometimes in private center-based childcare settings, sometimes in federal Head Start, and sometimes in state and local pre-kindergarten. So we've got sort of this vast array of places where kids are going to be. I'll probably refer to them as sectors throughout the talk, just so you know. And that means that it's very hard to collect any sort of data where we can make comparisons either across all of these different settings or even within them, particularly childcare, which actually serves the largest number of children from birth to 5. We're talking a bunch of small private businesses. So it's really hard to get them all to come together and do the same thing without the force of law. So this means we have not historically had any kind of unified snapshot covering all the places where young children receive care. And in particular, we very rarely have data that we can link to anything that might be meaningful for children and families, both developmental outcomes and things that are happening sort of day to day in the classrooms. So we haven't been able to answer some of the key questions that you've been able to answer in K-12 that have allowed us to make smart policy decisions. We historically have not known who works in early education and what their qualifications are. I was having an interesting conversation with Elizabeth about how we can't actually just pull early educators because the bulk of them likely do not have bachelor's degrees, but even that's been sort of largely unknown for a long period of time. We know little about the quality of early childhood settings or the credentials related to quality, sort of all of these baseline questions. Because we can't answer them, we also really can't answer questions about unintended consequences of policies. So often we're going to move a policy lever that's going to impact one sector. That's probably going to have a downstream implication on another sector, but we have not really been able to track that out and see over time what that has done. Bummer. This, I promise I'm going somewhere with this, but this does start, I want to, for my developmentalists in the room, I want to remind you that this stands in sharp contrast to the reality of child development, where we know kids are developing more in the first 5 years of life than they will at any other period. And they're building the sort of basic neural circuits that are going to underlie their skills in the long term, whether that's language, self-regulation, emotion regulation. We know that those teachers who we know so little about are the most essential ingredient in building a quality setting. Young children's learning is very relational. The people that they're having a small conversation with those are the people that are driving this miraculous development we see in the first 5 years. And it sort of ignores the fact that it's early childhood settings that really hold up our labor force. Early education ensures that caregivers can work or return to school. Right now, about 70% of children under 6 live in a household where all of their caregivers are working. So this is a lot of people. And when we provide high quality, accessible, stable early childhood, these people can work safely and calmly. So altogether, despite the fact that this could be a really efficient, if you will, time to create investments in young children, and we could have potential really high returns on investment because we'd see it both for those kiddos in the long term and for parents in the short term being able to invest in their own human capital. We don't have an optimal system. It wouldn't be efficient if we had one. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is walk through how my work and that of some of my colleagues with the Louisiana Department of Education and the Virginia Department of Education can stand as a story of how you can use data to make better decisions in early childhood, to help us sort of make the case that, hey, yes, let's keep collecting this data, let's keep making these investments, and to maybe serve as a template for thinking about how we can make the case for the importance of our work moving forward. So let's start with Louisiana. Louisiana is not necessarily a state that we think of when we think about getting hyped about educational outcomes, but it is a place where amazing educators are doing a lot with scarce public resources, so helpful to think about right now.
One state that's back above their 2019 levels in reading.
Oh God, could it be about early education? Let's hope so. I can't speak to that, but I'm going to hope for that in my mind. So the Early Childhood Education Act, which is known locally as Act 3, was passed in 2012. It called for the creation of an integrated ECE network with uniform standards of quality for all ECE sites that receive public funds. What does that mean? Well, it means that Louisiana started thinking about early childhood a little bit more from the perspective of the child and the family. A family doesn't come out and say, you know, I really want to put my kids in the Head Start sector. They're like, where am I going to put my 4-year-old? And they need to have access to quality no matter where they choose to go. Of course, their choices are going to be partially dictated by their needs in terms of labor market, closeness to work, whatever, cost. So they said, instead of thinking about this in terms of these sectors, we should have these geographic units where these parishes, which are like counties, where the counties are in charge of all of the early childhood sites that receive public funds in the area. So the parishes have these networks, and then within the networks, all the early childhood sites that receive public funds have to be participating in their quality rating and improvement system, and they're measured in the same way in terms of what quality looks like in the classroom. This is Louisiana. This bill was passed using the language and logic of accountability. They said, hey, we're paying public dollars for all of these sites for kids to receive care. They should be high quality, and kids should be ready. So it was sort of a very conservative kind of logic. But what it did was it allowed us to start thinking more broadly about data in the state. Specifically, because of their quality rating and improvement system, now we have this statewide cross-sector data with teacher names and observational measures of classroom quality collected at least twice annually. And when I say all sites that receive public funds, that's Head Start, that's public pre-K, but it's also those private childcare sites that receive public funds through childcare subsidies. Working in early childhood is a mouthful because you're always qualifying yourself. But in Louisiana, of course, there are lots of children from families who have low incomes. So a very high proportion of private childcare sites receive public dollars through subsidies. I think the last time I saw it was like over 70%. So it's a lot.
Which observational tool are they using for teacher assessment?
Yeah. So they're using the classroom assessment scoring system, or the CLASS as it's commonly known. Yeah. So they're doing class observations twice a year. Mm-hmm.
So who is doing the observations? In the design of that system, do they do anything that would help them learn about reliability? So, rather than have the same observer go back to the same site over and over again, could they assign different observers to, cross observe?
Great question. One I I have obsessed over. So there, so first of all, everyone that is doing observations gets trained through Teachstone, which is the developer of class, and they have to be trained to a certain level of reliability in order to be class certified. But then beyond that, the state sort of very quickly understood their incentives to inflate scores, particularly if you know who you're observing. So the state also has a third-party contractor that's sort of pulled from across the state, and then you're assigned to parishes that are not your own, and you go and you do observations. And then if the third-party observation is not within a point of the local observer, the local gets dropped and the third party stays. And that happens to half of sites each year. Half of classrooms get observed in this way each year. And so it's sort of, and it happens, it's allocated randomly. So it sort of keeps folks on their toes and helps build a culture of accountability in that way.
On that, do we know approximately how many cases there are of dropping because it's conflicted?
You know, I could look that up, but I don't know it off the top of my head. It's not particularly high, actually. Yeah. But I can get back to you on that. Did I see another hand? Same question. Got you. Scooped you. Okay. So I guess it's important to just sort of clarify, this is very exciting because it's statewide cross-sector data, which we've never had before, but it is fundamentally a site code, a site type, so that's sector type, a teacher's name, the lead teacher in the room, and observational quality. That's it. But that limited amount of data is actually a sea change in early childhood and allows us to ask questions that we've never been able to ask before. Yeah.
How should we think about class mapping to the early childhood setting? Like, is it a clean, when I think about what's happening in a sixth grade classroom, are these sorts of mechanics happening among 6-month-olds to a year and that? Yeah.
So do you mean it, when you say class mapping, you mean like what's happening in terms of curriculum daily?
Yeah, like the goals they're pursuing, what learning looks like. Yeah.
Yeah. So actually every state in the country has learning goals for kids as young as 3 at this point. And in Louisiana, at the time that we were doing this, there was sort of a bunch of investments they were making, but one of them was in making sure that every site was using a, gold tier is what they called it, curriculum. And so through all the way down toddler rooms, there's certainly curricula and there's sort of daily plans. There's a lot of variability in what those are. They're often very play-based, involved in sort of helping kids develop skills that we sort of think of as natural, but are very important for future things. Like, do you ever like go into a room and kids are like crumpling up tissue paper? And it's like, because they need to learn to hold a pencil. And they're actually like building those skills. I think that's so cool. Every time I talk to an early childhood teacher, I'm like, oh, you're really doing something. There are infant curricula as well. Myself, I have more question marks about those, I will admit, because I think so much of that is also just making sure that kids are well day to day.
Do you lose observations? People getting married and changing their name.
Oh my gosh, the possible maidens. We talked about them a lot. So I'll talk about the data more in a second, but yeah, so one thing we were worried about, given the makeup of the early childhood workforce, it's like 99% women. So we were worried, particularly in Louisiana, that we were going to see someone and then we were going to lose them, not because they were gone, but because they changed their name. So we spent a whole bunch of time sort of saying, what if you have the same first name, but a different last name, and you worked in the same parish? What if it was the same site? And so we sort of ended up creating, a system of flags in the data where it was like same first name, different last name, same site, same first name, different last name, same parish, etc. And our findings were pretty much, so first of all, what I'm going to show you is a ton of descriptive statistics. So saying our findings are robust to that sounds weird, but largely our estimates were not differing, more than like a percentage point or so when we sort of did the most conservative version of that versus the least. We called them the possible maidens until eventually we're like, should we be saying that? So we spent a lot of time thinking about that. Anything else? These are great questions because I don't have to think about this now when we get to the data part. Thank you so much. Okay. So what did we decide we wanted to explore? The first thing we wanted to think about was teacher turnover in early education settings. Historically, folks have assumed that turnover is quite high in early childhood. It's the kind of thing that anecdotally you hear a lot about. But if I'm a policymaker, I might raise a lot of questions about that. And I think this is fair because once again, we're talking about a bunch of private businesses. a policymaker might reasonably ask, is this a public problem? Is turnover so large and systematic that we think that this is something about the sector itself and we have to be thinking about this in a public way? Or is it about some sites that I'm hearing sob stories about, but honestly, they should probably close and we should move on with our lives? And so although we sort of had this language in research where we said we think turnover is high, if you talk to someone at the state level, they said, is it? Not unreasonable. But with this data, we could look at it specifically in Louisiana. So basically what we did was exactly what was sort of previewed. We took the names from the fall of 2015. We looked to see if we saw them again in the same site in the fall of 2016. We also would check if we saw them the next semester, we counted them as having seen them. We assumed that there was some sort of glitch, right? So this was our first round of information from that. So these are teacher turnover rates across the 3 largest center-based sectors. Center-based childcare, remember, these are all sites that receive public dollars. The turnover rate there was 46%. For Head Start, it was 34%. And for school-based pre-K, it was 26%. This purple dotted line here represents what Louisiana reported as their K-12 turnover rate that year, which was 12%. So about half of what you saw in school-based pre-K, which was, of course, about half of what you saw in childcare. Actually, last night, for the first time ever, which is an embarrassing thing to admit, I Googled what people think the optimal turnover rate should be. Why had I not done that before? But it turns out if the job is high-skilled, folks in, I think, labor economics say that they think the optimal turnover rate is about 10%. So there you go, as a comparison point. So this was the data that we presented. We also, I'm showing you 2015, 2016, but, we could replicate this across the years that we had the data, and we're not seeing huge wiggles in the point estimates from year to year. Yeah.
2 questions. One, does turnover mean leaving the
The site.
site?
Yes, although I will talk about,
Another.
that's the next graph.
I guess the bigger question is, like, maybe the opportunity to turn over more often is a job amenity, like for that are being attracted to this sector. That is like, I mean, we could imagine another version of the world in which we treat early child care differently, but we're in the world we're in. And like maybe the ability to come and go from employment is actually something that's attractive to the workforce that are filling these jobs. So do we know much about what their outside options are? Are they going to work in retail? Are they not working? They're at home doing something else. If they're not, when they're moving in and out of early child.
Yeah, so on the next slide, you'll see, first of all, that most people that are leaving working in publicly funded early childhood altogether. So it's not just a story where they're popping from site to site or from sector to sector. So that's sort of your first question. And then as to your second question, this we don't have systematically in these data. Using some survey data from Virginia, where we worked really hard to go after the leavers, we found that a lot of them just go work at big box stores because they say this job is too hard and I can make more money. Now, the time that we did that survey was a sort of that wiggly time when inflation was going up and, it was in the news how much people could now make at a Target or whatever. But even there, I think I would argue that even if it's a job amenity, we might be losing something for young children. If there was this level of turnover in school-based sites, not school-based sites, in K-12 schools, people would kick up a real fuss. And so something I'll look at later is whether or not we sort of see the same returns on experience for early childhood educators as we see in K-12, because that was something else we wanted to be able to talk to with policymakers about, because it is a real question. Do we lose anything when we lose these people? But I'd argue that the data is suggesting yes.
I have a question about context, and this isn't my area, so apologies if it's obvious to you, but I'm curious how benefits and salaries are changing across these 3 sectors that you're showing us here.
Yeah, we'll talk about that more in a second. But so these folks in Louisiana, but not everywhere, have pretty much parity with K-12. In most states, that's not the case. It's very rare for there to be parity across salary and benefits. And in most states, particularly if their early childhood state pre-K program is what's called mixed delivery, which means they're in both schools and in private childcare, the school teachers might be closer to parity, but the ones that are in community-based sites will not have parity. But in Louisiana, they do. And then they're about in the middle. And then These guys are making about half of what those people are making. So I think, and that is not statewide data, but we collected data in 2 parishes, Louisiana and Jefferson, around the same time that this data was collected, and these folks were making just under 20 grand a year, and those folks were making just under 40.
So do you have observations only for teachers that were observed? So I know in Virginia, if they couldn't get the classroom that they wanted, they would just go to a classroom. And
So they need to be in every classroom here. So if what the system works such that a schedule is set up by the network for when the observations are going to happen, and they walk in, they get the name of the teacher in the room who is the lead teacher, who in theory they have already gotten the name of, and then they conduct the observation. You can call like the day before if something is going to happen and try to change the observation. And probably because that doesn't happen that much. But so it should be that it's the lead teacher in the room. It matches to the name that you were given by the director at the beginning of the year. Now, because turnover is happening so frequently, that's not always the case. And sometimes observers will show up and just do who is in the room. We messed around with trying to figure out how much that happens and how much of a problem that is in Jefferson Parish by trying to send our observers for a study that we were doing at the same time as the state observers. But we didn't end up being able to collect much data because we started that in the spring of 2020. So we lost that.
I wonder how much heterogeneity in turnover rates there is. So like this just reminds me of back in the early 80s, there was a big literature on the length of spells for people receiving welfare. Turns out there were 2 very different populations of welfare recipients. There were the folks who had high probabilities of staying that end up making up a large share of the stock of welfare recipients at any point in time. But there was another group that with very high turnover who were just on for very short spells. And I wonder whether something similar could be going on than we're here, like that, where there might be some types of teachers who
Pop in and pop out.
have a very high turnover, like even higher than it. And then they're mixed in with some folks who have a very stable, rate. And if it would be possible to predict who was in the second group.
Yeah, so what we're going to do next is go to longitudinal turnover rates. And then in Virginia, we're able to look a little bit more closely at turnover rates based on the amount of previous time you've spent working in an early childhood site. So we do see that sort of there are folks that seem to stay longer, but it's just not a large proportion of the workforce at all. We'll kind of get to that in a second.
Like, would it be predictable who they are going to be based on observables at the front end? If so, then okay, let's hire more of that.
Yeah, so this is something that we are working on with the Virginia data in particular, but also is kind of related to the data system issue where it's difficult to know. A lot of that is predicted by sort of not being able to go somewhere else, so not having a bachelor's degree, and also your wage is what we can see so far. But there's certainly more questions, I think. One thing that's very true, as you often see with K-12 educators, is that people who start the job all report, like, I want to do this, I love working with young children, etc. And I think they try to stay for a long time, but the job itself is very demanding and it's very low wage. So a lot of them, leave. From a physical perspective, it's always very demanding, and also very demanding in a way that you wouldn't necessarily think of for K-12 because they're bending down, they're moving, they're picking people up. So that we could potentially keep people for longer, but we don't know. Yeah. Or, change the structure so they have places to go, or move them out of an infant room where they're doing less picking up. But, there hasn't been a structure to look at that. Okay. So, one of the other nice things about this data is that we're able to look at people year after year after year, not just look at them from year to year. It's nice to see that we have similar estimates of turnover year to year. But, a policymaker could still reasonably wonder, oh, well, is this just kind of a blip period? What happens if we look at people over time? Or is it just that they leave in their first year, but then everybody else stays? And then the other question is exactly the question that Eric asked, where people say, well, are they leaving their site or are they leaving early childhood in general? Now, we can't look at all early childhood sites. We can only look at early childhood sites that receive public funds. But as I said earlier, that is the bulk of them in Louisiana. So this is going to show you that longitudinal turnover rate. The bars are retention. The x-axis here is semester to semester. The green bars are those that stayed in their site, and the blue are those that stayed in ECE. So of course, mechanically, these are always going to be a little bit higher, right? So after the first semester, we've lost about 10% at both. After the first year, you can see that this sort of maps on a little bit to the 15-16 estimates that we showed you before, with about 32% having left their sites. And then if you sort of track all the way down by fall of 2019, only about 40% of folks remained at the site that they started, and about 45% remained in early childhood altogether. So it's just a massive loss of folks. And again, is something that's suggestive of a more of a systematic sort of public level problem, because we see this really large decrease over time. And in particular, I think the fact that we're not seeing a huge difference between the green bar and the blue bar at the end of the series.
Do you see a shift toward a specific sector of those folks that stayed in the field but left their site? Are they shifting sectors as well to maybe more the public, barring that they need a usually BA?
A lot of it is within sector shifting, because in Louisiana, you have to have a bachelor's degrees to work in school-based pre-K. That might look different in a state where that's not the case. But yeah, good question. Okay, someone else said the same one. Okay. So just because I'm trying to tell a story a little bit about what the benefit of data is, you might be like, you just told me that everybody already knew turnover was high, and then you came up with some stats that told them turnover was high. Why was that helpful? Well, this actually was pretty powerful for both lawmakers and people doing work at the network level in Louisiana. It was externally valid, so they weren't like, okay, so that's just this one site. It was local, so they thought about their communities when we presented them with this data. And we could show them the same information year after year, so they were confident in the consistency of the data. I would also argue that the sort of number was pretty sticky, and it was something that you could communicate in a bite-sized way. And so we presented it to folks both at the state level and at the smaller level. They immediately started asking the same kind of follow-up questions you were asking, like, well, can we predict this? What do we know? Because they were imagining their communities in a way that they were not before when they were reading papers or just kind of reading a sad story in the news. So we tried to give them the information that we had based on the data we had. So the first thing that folks were really wondering was whether or not this was just a new teacher problem. So we tried to look at that. Of course, because of the nature of the data we have, we don't actually ask people information, right? We just see their name. So all we can actually do is know if we saw them the year before. So I have new teachers. I'm going to have a line for new teachers here in green and a line for blue for returning. But note that new teachers just means I saw them for the first time in the data in 2016. I did not see them the year before, but they could have been there the year before for all we know, or they could have just not been working in publicly funded ECE. So that is a bit of an issue. Similar setup. We have a 1 here because that's 100% of the folks we observed in fall 2016, and then it's just who we lose over time. So after the first semester, we've lost about 22% of the new teachers, but we've lost very few of the returning teachers. At the end of the first year, we've lost about half of the new teachers and about a quarter of the returning teachers. And then we see this continued dip over time, such that 3 years out, just over 20% of teachers who were new in fall of 2016 remain in their sites. So this is a massive loss. If I'm a childcare site, I am constantly recruiting. But I think the other thing worth noting is that we're not seeing a huge retention rate among the returning teachers. It's not just because if I've seen you before, I'm going to continue to see you again.
So, so in the K-12 space, even though turnover are lower than this, it's easy to quantify the costs of it. How much more effective teachers become from their first to their second to their third year. If you have a slot with a high, turnover rate, it means kids are constantly getting a first year teacher. And since first year teachers are less effective, that's a costly thing. But like, do we know if we have any kind of output, measure or QRIS scores for by teacher year of teaching, first, second, third? It'd be easier to.
Do you want to know the answer now or in 15 minutes? Yeah, no, I mean, it's an important question because we haven't had data systems, whether or not it actually matters has been a very open question for a long time. So yes, we're thinking the same thing. Okay. The other thing we did was sort of look across the different early childhood sectors. I'm just going to show you childcare and school-based pre-K because Head Start tends to just run right in the middle and it makes my graph sloppy. But unsurprisingly, we see a pattern that mimics what we saw in just the year-to-year, right? Where there's turnover is much higher in childcare settings. And so of the cohort of folks that started in fall 2016, by the time we're in fall 2019, only 30% of them remain. And again, it's about half in school-based pre-K. Now, of course, I titled this slide turnover rates are higher in low-wage sectors because I have a bias where I think a lot about wages, but there are huge differences across these two sectors in ways that have nothing to do with wage. The early educators in school-based pre-K, first of all, are working in schools. They often have a cohort of peers. They have bachelor's degrees. So this doesn't necessarily give policymakers a clear answer. So because of the limitations of these data, that's about all we could do with them. So it's great and we could answer new questions, but much is changing across these different ways that we can cut the data that we can't see or understand. So we did do a lot of local surveys, which we were able to match to this data in Louisiana, and that was useful, and we've answered a lot of questions using that data that I'm not going to talk about here. But it was really amazing to me how quickly, even within the state of Louisiana, people would say, oh, but we're not Orleans. Oh, but we're not Jefferson. So even though I was like, yeah, but it's like next door to you, it very quickly they said, but this isn't our data. This isn't our place. So this isn't related to us anymore. And so this was very much top of mind when we started building a data system in Virginia. So in 2019, we received a preschool development grant to work with the Virginia Department of Education and the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation. And what we decided to do was try to work with them to build a data system. Part of it was that the leader that had been working in Louisiana also moved to Virginia. And so, as I'll talk about at the end, like a visionary leader who's committed to data does help. So we piloted this in 2019 where we had just sort of selected communities and we had site leaders fill out information in the Link B5 data system. We, as part of another study, had teachers fill out this registration data so we could see the teachers. And then we've been working on linking that up to other data systems. So Department of Social Services data, the child care subsidy data, and the Virginia Quality Rating and Improvement data, because we would like to eventually be able to have a system where we can talk about all of these things together so we can answer some of the questions that you all are asking. So this is great. Using the same logic that Louisiana used, they actually also passed a bill in 2020 making participation in Link B5 mandatory. And it was the same logic that we had heard in Louisiana. These are public dollars. We want to hold people accountable. What do we know about where these dollars are going, the kind of quality that kids are getting, and whether or not we're creating the right kind of solutions? So once again, we've got all of this information, but now we have a lot more detailed reporting from site leaders and data from teachers. And so we can say a little bit more than we used to. I'm going to continue to think about turnover because I'm telling a story of one talk, but you can ask other questions. So I'm going to start by using that registration data and linking it to teacher turnover information. And this is data from fall of 2023. One thing I want to flag is that in Louisiana, we had this nice cross-sector data, but here I have data only in childcare. So do keep that in mind when you're sort of comparing the numbers that you see here. These, again, are the childcare centers that receive public funding. And again, this is a lot of centers and arguably from a policy perspective, the ones we care about because we give them the dollars. So this is... This fall 2023 data has about 14,400 teachers. This is 81% of all teachers. I just told you it was mandatory, so you might be like, what? Part of this is because there's not a ton of teeth to it. It's not like they're like, well, so we're firing you. They want you to stay, as you'll see in a second. But also sometimes, teachers get hired and then leave before they have time to fill out their registration. And arguably, if they don't fill out their registration, they may be more likely to leave. So just that small limitation. So who are Virginia child care teachers, just so you have a sense? In terms of education level, we see a lower rate of bachelor's degree attainment than we see across sectors, but similar to childcare specific estimates, where about 20% of folks have a BA or more. In terms of years of experience, I think this is a relatively high experience sample. We have a median experience of 5 years, but you can see that we have that 54% kind of that Tom was asking about that has been there for a while. In terms of race ethnicity, consistent with national data, we see a very diverse workforce and one that maps onto the demographics of the children that they serve. So this is a big conversation in early childhood, is that unlike the K-12 workforce, this tends to look more like the children they're working with. And of course, consistent with national data, this is a very low wage workforce. So the mean hourly wage in 2023 was $16.28. And if you sort of look at the distribution, you can see almost half of our teachers were earning less than $15 an hour. Our highest category here has only 7.4%, and that's more than $21 an hour. The MIT living wage calculator, does anybody use that? So I'm on it all the time. The living wage for a single person in Virginia with no children was at this time $25.65.
Sorry, I think you probably already said this, but what year is this data coming from?
2023.
Do you see, like, if you look, or do you have data for previous years?
Here? No.
But if you look at the percent of median years of experience, is that like 5 or more years, that percent 54? Do you see that change? Like, are we seeing any change in the percentage of the ECCE like teachers who are staying for 5 or more years?
So are more people staying for longer? Yeah. So I can't answer that yet. I don't have that information, but in the future we could potentially. Yeah.
Class. What is the lowest teacher ratios?
What is the student teacher ratio? Let's see. I think in Virginia it's oh, thank you then.
I manage a child development center in Arlington, Virginia.
Oh. Do you want to finish up?
Data system was implemented. We were
But in an infant classroom, it's 1 to 2. In ages 2 and 3, it's 1 to 6. And then in ages 4 and 5, it's 1 to 10.
Thank you. My head is full of the California numbers now. So push. Yes. With infants, I like to say that the ratio is like how many babies could you grab in a fire? That's how they save. But then it gets as kids get a little older. Yeah.
Wait, you're talking about age session earlier, and I didn't even know if it made sense in this contest, but like your turnover graphs, could you break them out by like the
age served? Yeah, we have done that. And turnover is much higher in toddler rooms than in preschool age rooms. And that would mechanically be true because of the sector difference. So because school-based has such lower turnover and those kids are all in preschool. But if we look within sector as well, toddler turnover is also higher than preschool age turnover in childcare only classrooms. At the time of those data, infant observations were not required. So we only had toddler and preschool.
Our stays
In this data, this is center-based. Yeah. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to do was just find out how much teacher turnover there was in Virginia and whether or not it was similar to what we saw in Louisiana. So again, recalling that this is just childcare, we saw 38% turnover rate overall, so a little bit lower than we saw in Louisiana. Yay. But not by much, less than 10 percentage points. The other thing that's nice about the Virginia data is that we can finally look at turnover by lead and assistant. So in early childhood settings, in part because these ratios are so small, we often have settings in the room where there's a lead and there's assistants in order to help keep the ratios manageable, but also to sort of pay a little bit less. And so you can see here that turnover is a little bit lower for leads than it is for assistants. So this would actually be the number that you would compare to the Louisiana data specifically. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to show you just these two bars, mostly because I think overall it's interesting and because lead is the comparison point, but we actually don't really see different patterns when we look just at assistant teachers. So then we started to think, yeah.
So is it, should I be thinking about like a TA assistant, like a K-12 setting, like very assistant as a teacher, or is this just this person who's not in charge but doing meaningfully the same things?
Person who's not in charge who's doing meaningfully the same things. But there's also a lot of times in childcare something called floaters, which is basically people that come in and they make sure that you're in ratio, because technically somebody from licensing could show up and say, oh, you have the wrong number of kids in the room with these adults, and so therefore you're going to get, sanctions of some kind. So then floaters are there in case somebody has to step out to pop in, and those folks typically are doing less. Thank you. Okay, so then we wanted to use this data to start answering questions that we couldn't answer in the Louisiana data. So first I'm just going to show you this as figures, and then I'll tell you about our regression results as well. But basically we first started looking at turnover based on experience. So again, we have the sort of turnover rate here in the green bar, so sort of a flip as opposed to the retention graphs I was showing earlier. So for folks that had less than a year of experience, about half were leaving. This is blue is overall and green is lead, my apologies. And then we see sort of this consistent gradient. And by the time we get to those who have been working in UCE for 5 or more years, we have a much lower turnover rate, but still that of about 30%. And this is year-to-year turnover from 2023 to 2024, so fairly hot off the press. So we see this gradient as we'd expect based on the Louisiana data, but now we can get a finer grained look at it because we are able to match it specifically to teachers. We then looked at education because there's been huge debate in early childhood about whether or not increasing education requirements might lead to a more stable workforce. So similar setup here. We were surprised to find a fairly mixed pattern in here. We're not seeing this strong gradient that we might have expected, and so we were sort of looking forward to the regression results to potentially clean up this mess. And then we looked at wages and observed, perhaps unsurprisingly, a very strong gradient, where the turnover rate was almost double for those that are earning the lowest wages than those that are earning the highest wages. You can see that even among the high wage earning teachers, we have a turnover rate of more than 20%. But as you look at that, I'd like you to remind you of the living wage estimate and how this is, $4 or more less an hour than that estimate. So potentially we're just sort of not getting individuals to a high enough wage to prevent them from leaving the job when something better comes along.
I think it would be very interesting to see the correlation between social indicators and teacher turnover. Like in my experience as a practitioner, I had teachers who would stay for many, many years, but only because their husband who's really good paying job. So I was wondering if you were able to suss any of that out.
Yeah, we have been able to look at that a little bit in the data from Louisiana because we've had sort of the same question because a lot of people do seem to get into the work because they love it, and then there's a sense that they're sort of leaving, potentially because they can't make it work anymore. So in those data, what we've done is we've basically asked folks, how much of the household income is your wage contributing? And we do seem to see that the people who are contributing a greater proportion of their household income are leaving at a higher rate. But that also sort of gets muddy pretty quick with how much they're actually paid, marital status, some of the other things. But we are generally seeing the pattern you're describing. Yeah. Okay. Then we did run some regression models because obviously these things all move together, even within the childcare sector. We did this in 2 ways. We first ran it just looking within regions because, of course, even within a state, there's tremendous variation in cost of living across the different places you can be. And then we looked at these within sites as well. And we found that this is in the overall sample, leads were less likely to turn over, just as we saw sort of in the overall cut. That education, once we sort of clean it up, was positively related to turnover, such that if you had that BA or more, you were far more likely to turn over than if you did had a high school diploma or less. And then experiencing wages, which we put in the model, whether we put them in categorically as you observed, or if we put them in continuously, were strongly negatively related to turnover. So sort of the relationships that we observe hold even in these much more controlled models. So what? And this is kind of what Tom's question was before. Turnover is high. I've told you that we start at the top knowing that. And it's predicted by wages, experience, and education, mostly in ways that we might have predicted. But then the question of whether or not turnover matters is the obvious next question, and one that historically we also have not been able to answer in early childhood, much to our chagrin. So the first thing we asked was whether or not we could demonstrate that teachers, in fact, do improve over time. If you believe that this is skilled work, you might think that this is sort of a duh question, but the skill of the work of early education has been something that's been under question. So what we were able to do in the data from Louisiana was basically look at those class scores over time and see whether or not we saw an increase. And I've got 2 bars on this graph, but I'll have a third one in the next graph. So the dark blue bar is starting from those folks who returned in the fall of 2016. So we don't know how much experience we have, but we know that we saw them before. And then these are the ones that we know are completely green in the fall of 2016. And you can see that in both cases, we see this sort of sharp increase in returns to experience. And this is about, for the newest teachers, that line is about 2/3 of a standard deviation. Now, of course, the first thing that you might think when you see this line is, oh, but didn't you tell me that all these people leave? So this line is obviously both a mix of, where they started and the fact that the lowest performing teachers are dropping out. So we also ran a model where we looked at just the folks who were new in the fall of 2016 and then stayed over time. So as you might expect, the difference between the returning teachers and those new teachers is quite reduced at the very first semester. So they're starting the classroom better off, but we still see this sort of upward trajectory that particularly, to Tom's point, in the first year really parallels some of the folks that ultimately leave. And so we do see this improvement over time. Now,
Was fall of 2016, this is Louisiana, was fall of 2016 the first time that these centers and teachers had experienced the class?
no. So the class rollout started in the 13-14 year and then was sort of scaled up over time. By 2015, it was mandatory statewide, and we started in 2016 so we can get this look at the new versus returning. But so they had been doing it for a while.
Classes born in Virginia.
It was, but this is Louisiana. But honestly, no, it's all exactly as you're saying though, because Jenna Conway, the leader of both Virginia and Louisiana, had a parent who was a professor at UVA. So it all comes back around. Yeah.
And these are all audit measures, or are they a combination of audit, or do you see any differences between the audits and the in-home?
So this is the state data, so it's going to be local unless they've replaced with the audit. But we don't really find differences when we, carve out just using, we haven't ever used all third party because we lose half of our observations, right? Because they only do half. But whether or not we use all local or local with replacement, we don't see a difference in the trends.
By the way, with this, the green line, you could calculate what is the cost of, or what would be the benefit of lowering the, turnover rate by 10 points or whatever.
That is the next step. We just got this one out, so that's going to be a new paper.
Should we be concerned at all about, it's kind of weird to put in this context, but sorting such that new teachers are getting maybe older students or younger students or more quote unquote difficult class pairs?
Yeah. That is a good question. I mean, I think one thing to think about is how many new teachers there really are. But yeah, I mean, I think in general, there's reason to be concerned. All we are able to control for here, so this is a predicted scores controlling for age and for sector. So, but that's not going to account for, whether or not somebody ultimately does, get more likely to be stuck with a toddler. Early childhood teachers have strong preferences for the age of kids they teach in the same way that K-12 teachers do, it turns out. but I can't, answer your question with any definitive way.
Is there any way you could give us a sense of what a difference between a 4.7 and a 5?
Knew this question would come. It is very hard to think about this because there has not been the kind of study where we can sort of like causally assign a class score and then look at differences in child outcomes. And the sort of back of the envelope estimate that we gave was that this was about a 0.05 standard deviation increase in child outcomes. But even that was like really wiggly based on data we had taken in Louisiana in 2014, linking that to child outcomes and sort of extrapolating from that. So it's like very back of the envelope. Part of the reason that we don't know a lot about this in early childhood is because of the difficulty of collecting child outcome data and the fact that kids are so young that there's a lot of movement, from day to day, from moment to moment, and sort of how you would do if you assess them. So, the totally blanking on the name of the big assessment society that always meets on the back end of ARA. Mason? Thank you. I'm like looking at you like, come on, help a sister out. So they had a report several years back that basically went into sort of why it's so difficult to sort of suggest that we should be doing standardized testing among young children and ultimately saying we probably should not. And so this is why when we're looking at outcomes, we often end up looking at inputs instead. But then there's a lot of questions about the link between inputs and outputs that there just are not good answers to.
Do Virginia and Louisiana use similar assessment tools for child development? I know, like, here in Cambridge Public Schools, we're working on rolling out ASQs and.
Yeah, so in Louisiana, they use the TS Gold and they use a modified version of the DRDP. And in Virginia, they use TS Gold and then they have something called VKRP, which they designed to look specifically at math and literacy at kindergarten entry. Okay. Teachers improve over time, yay. The other thing that you might think about here, besides sort of the quality that children experience, is what this might mean for sites staying open and providing services to families. So I said at the beginning of the talk that the other big thing that we do is provide places for kids to spend time when their parents have to work or go to school. And so this now is survey data from Virginia, taken right around the same time as the turnover data that we saw. And what we're doing is we're asking sites, first of all, is staffing challenging? And you could see that the bulk of sites, 55% say that staffing is very challenging. If I made this very or moderately challenging, that turns to 93%, but that felt like cheating, so I just showed very. And then of the folks that had to hire in the past year, we asked them sort of about the implications of having to go through that process. And this is 88% of folks said yeah, and we had to do a bunch of hiring last year. Of those folks, 80% said one of the ramifications of struggling to hire is that my current staff are taking on additional tasks and additional hours. I'm hiring inexperienced and underqualified staff. I'm serving fewer children and turning away families, and I'm closing classrooms. And so these last two in particular are really meaningful in terms of families having stable access to care. It takes a lot of work often to find a childcare center that you can pay for, that's where you need it to be, that's going to be open in the hours that you need it to be, that has the right sick policy. And then that classroom closes, that's the kind of thing that pushes you over the edge. So it also seems that this instability does just matter for what a site can do in terms of stably serving a family. Although, of course, this is fairly loose data, but it's what we have. I think it's just bad for kids, girl. I have another paper that looks at that in the context of Head Start, but I also wouldn't want to tell this friend that her favorite teacher quit. And it's bad for teachers, which I think I always want to make sure that we call out. So often we spend a bunch of time being like, but is it good for kids? Is it good for families? But it's also bad for these folks who work full-time jobs, caring for our youngest learners, and are experiencing the consequences of other people leaving and, struggling with whether or not they can stay in the field themselves. So now what? I said at the start of this talk that I was going to make the pitch that using data and having data helps us make better decisions, and these better decisions lead to better outcomes. And so I'm going to keep making that argument. This is class data from Louisiana over a 4-year period following the rollout of the QRIS and the start of this data collection. So obviously this isn't causal, right? And Louisiana was doing a lot of things in this time period. It wasn't just that they started tracking and like, et voila, improvement. But nonetheless, we see all 3 bars, which represent the 3 large center-based sectors, pre-K on top, Head Start in the middle, childcare in the bottom. We did see improvement in class scores over time, and we did see the largest improvements for childcare. So that's exciting. We also were able to do this parish by parish, and so we could show local areas each year, this is what's happening in your specific locality, and folks could see how they grew and changed, and they could, make tweaks as necessary. Anecdotally, after we would provide this information to networks, many of them would say, okay, can you get me specific information about where I am? Because I'm going to use this data to write a grant to get funding from some private business to do professional development, or to do teacher incentives, or to do a staff appreciation day, or whatever it was. So they started using this data to make these pitches and find new partners that were going to provide funding for them. So I can't say that that causally linked up, but I can say that folks do react to knowing local data. The policymakers enjoy knowing what's working instead of just constantly being told like you're failing. So I, couldn't tell them that what exactly they were doing that worked, but I could say like something did. Great job. And I think there was real value for them in knowing about their own communities. Yeah.
Portion of times in each of the parishes fairly equal across the states? No.
Okay. And then I think the other thing to point out is that these wins, even if they're small and even if they're not necessarily causal, give people sort of incentive to keep investing more and can lead to bigger changes. So in Louisiana, state funding for ACE has actually tripled since the passage of Act 3, which is wild. And they have this program called the School Readiness Tax Credit, which gives dollars directly to early educators, and you get more money for the higher your class score. And this has become a model for many other states in thinking about how can we sort of invest directly into early educators. It's a refundable tax credit. It's great. In Virginia, we're working on doing the same thing, but of course we have less information that's ready to share. And we're sort of working on making it even more accessible. So this is a picture of a data system sort of sharing platform that we've made where folks can go on and gather Link B5 data from their specific region. So this is just sort of the front page of the navigation, but you can go through a whole bunch of data. You can pick just your region, and then you can use it. And it's much more efficient than having them email me, which is what they did in Louisiana. And so you can look at it for all these different things. Now, we do technically have an ACF grant right now that's going to help us study both this system and how folks are using this system to make change, but TBD if we'll have that tomorrow. Bummer. In Virginia, this access to this data has been helpful. The teacher recognition grants, which I think my colleague presented on here a few years ago, has helped retain teachers. And every year they sort of take some of this data back to help continue getting that funding for that grant program. They've introduced a new version of cost modeling, which has increased revenue for subsidy receiving sites, where they're basically saying, okay, part of what quality is teacher stability. Part of teacher stability is providing training experiences and providing wages. Let's bake that into the subsidy reimbursement model. So there's a real change in how funding is provided. And that's one of the things we're trying to study in this grant is, directly linking that new funding model to some of these outcomes. And in total, there's been, over this period of time, unprecedented bipartisan investment in early childhood in both states. So you might be like, well, how do I build this data system? As I said before, visionary leaders do matter. Having someone who thinks the data is useful is going to be sort of the baseline for this. But I think the more we sort of use data and get it out there, the more people come into these state positions looking for that. In these 2 southern states, arguments for accountability worked really well. So sort of taking this vision of what data is as a way to sort of hold people accountable and to make better and more efficient decisions was strikingly effective. The other thing that I think was true, particularly in Virginia, is that we were able to leverage existing data sources and focus our time on investing in linkages. If you talk to a child care leader, especially, they'll say, we have to do so much reporting. Are you kidding me? Like, we have so much that we already have to do. Okay, but what if we just started linking that? And what if we just did a little bit of data collection for teachers? It changes what's available. We did have to put our pet research interests in the back seat. Part of it is you want this to be sustainable, and leaders and teachers are going to do it, even though it's mandatory. We only had 81% of teachers fill it out. So we had to kind of clean up and think about what's useful for the state right now. And so we did do that. And then we really did have to, we did a lot of focusing on data sharing. I was chatting with other people about, like, how did you get your high response rates? I drove around to a lot of childcare centers in Louisiana. It was time consuming, but it fixes issues so quickly. They understand the problems exist long before you do, and they will tell you, and then you can fix it. And then the immediate use of data really drives investment in both producing the data and, investing in collecting it further. Now you might be like, okay, that's all pie in the sky. Don't you need investment? And you're right. But let me make a couple of quick pitches before I end this talk. I think if you make the data local and you make it real and you don't stop with journal articles, this helps a lot. Part of what we were able to do in the States was make it so people turn to data first when they have a question. And that's incredible. And I think that is what's going to keep some of this going for longer. It's not going to seem like a waste of time if it's something you use on a regular basis. I also think in this particular time, partnerships are a way that we can build data capacity for agencies that we know are going to be understaffed. I'm in a land grant institution. It feels a little bit like it's my job to be thinking about how the work that I do and my students do can build a data system that might otherwise be falling into disrepair at the public level. This is also going to be really true as we see a shifting of funding from federal to state, and people are trying to quickly build up capacity for things that they didn't have to do before. We also found data as a way to support other private-public partnerships. Folks used our data to get money from unexpected sources, and I think this is going to continue to be a movement that we're going to see. And how can we give them the narrative that they need to sell it to people that have the money to give? And I think similarly to that, we need to make the case for efficiency. We can target the investments better if we know what the problems are instead of just sort of speculating. I think we owe it to these kids to do a good job of that, and we owe it to their teachers too. And that's it. Did I make it?
So I think we have time for they were able to ask during this up one. Andrew.
So this I was laughing about it because every PIER fellow has to take my class. I forced them to sign up for it because it's free. So thank you for this. And on the measurement fronts, have you looked at whether those changes over time differ by domain and dimension? Class, like are there particular gains in particular domain?
Yeah, so for those of you who are less familiar with the class, it's divided into these different subdomains and dimensions. And in both the toddler side and on the preschool side, it's the domains that are more about instruction that seem to be more predictive of child outcomes. It's instructional support for pre-K and engaged supports for learning in toddlers. We do see more growth in instructional support. We haven't made a huge fuss over it because it's not that much more, and also because those scores start so much lower. So, in some ways, it's like the instructional support is driving what we see here. Emotional support sort of starts high and stays high. We don't see a lot of people going into the classrooms and saying, like, these teachers aren't warm. But we also do know that there's been a ton of coaching, particularly on instruction and language modeling in particular. And when you talk narratively to the networks, that's what they say really mattered. And they have all these fun strategies where they have teachers hold little microphones underneath them so they can hear themselves talking, and it makes them talk better. It's been very fun to watch the coaching. They say it works. We have not evaluated it.
Dana.
First of all, thank you so much for doing this work. As an early childhood person, it's just so wonderful. I always see all of this happening in the US. And I guess my question is I loved your perspective. We have QRAS in nearly every single state. Yeah. Now you have the question about why don't we have more of this? If there is these sites are already being required in most places to collect data, not necessarily the class and all that, but why has it taken so long for us to make use of the data in the way that you have? What are the big barriers that and see in this brain?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think a couple of things are at play here. Many state QRS participation is still not mandatory, even for publicly funded sites. So in both of these states, right, I'm still not getting private pay, as we heard. I'm getting only sites that have public funds. And in some states, even if you receive public funds, participation in the QRS is not necessarily mandatory. Then really the structure of the QRS matters a lot. When the QRS was being developed in Louisiana, for example, they thought about it in tandem with data use. A lot of other places, the development of QRS came from a bunch of stakeholders in a room kind of hashing it out. And so they're really scattershot. I mean, some states it's like, do you have a welcome board? And that's the indicator you have. And then so you're only getting this very superficial site level data. And you're not capturing things about the teachers, or if you are, you're only getting it at this very aggregated level. And so you're not able to say, for example, say this specific teacher is here and then they were not. Under Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge, more states tried to do workforce registries to try to get at this, particularly the stability of the person in the room side. And so there are more states now that are trying to answer these questions, at least on the stability side, but they're having sort of this similar problem to what we have in Louisiana, where they're only really getting teacher names. And they're still not required for everyone. And so this idea that we could see broadly is not there. And then in those states, typically that's also just for childcare. So it's sort of a storm of things that came together to make these work relative to what's happening everywhere else. But it does seem like we should have been able to pull that out with QRIS.
Perfect or comprehensive and having some data seats by.
Then none. Make that pitch to your policymaker.
So please join me. And so that seminar is on April 8th. And it's Tom D. Stanford is going to be presenting Accelerating Opportunity, the Effects of Instructionally Supported Beat Travel. So thanks everybody for joining us, and hopefully see you in April. And don't forget to mention if you have a friend who's a G1 or G2 who might be interested in the program to look on the website and or reach out to Ashley Dixon. So thanks.